Welcome back. You're watching Nation Tonight. On a day India signed the historic 10-year contract on the Chabahar Port with Iran, the United States has now threatened to sanction us. State Department spokesperson Vedant Patel said that any country having business dealings with Iran runs the risk of sanctions. My colleague Rishabh spoke with American Ambassador to India, Eric Garcetti, on this matter. Listen into that conversation.
India signed a long-term contract with Iran on Chabahar Port. This morning we heard it from the US State Department Deputy Spokesperson talking about potential risk of sanctions when it comes to dealing with Iran. If you can tell us what exactly it means, is it a warning in a way to Indian entities or India as a whole of potential sanctions?
We'll have to get some further clarification on that. But what I would say is, in general terms, I think the point that was being made is that doing business with Iran while they're exporting terrorism has resulted in clear policies from the United States that companies need to be aware of, where we see in the Middle East right now, through proxy forces, and now directly even firing the missiles at another sovereign state, as they did against Israel just a couple weeks ago, that Iran needs to make sure that it joins the international system and stops exporting terrorism. And folks that do business with Iran in general need to be aware of those risks and challenges, even as we clarify specifically for the port.
Now remember, India's investment in the operation of a terminal at the strategically important Chabahar port in Iran is a move that will boost regional connectivity as well as trade ties. For the first time, India will be managing an overseas port. It will serve as an alternative route for trade with Central Asia, bypassing Pakistan. It's also a shorter trade route with Europe. And because Chabahar acts as a counter to Pakistan's Gwadar port, it also helps India in countering the Chinese influence in the region, in strategically dealing with the string of pearls strategy of China. Now, with the US threatening sanctions, it's interesting that this stance by America is in sharp contrast to what it had said earlier. Back in 2018, the US had granted a waiver specifically for the Chabahar port, particularly when it comes to supporting Afghanistan. The 2018 statement highlighted the significance of exemptions that were made by the United States, which had cited the importance of reconstruction and economic development of Afghanistan. So what changed now? And particularly, can the United States even dictate terms to India? To talk more on this, I'm joined by Ambassador Ashok Sajjanhar. I'm also joined by Captain Alok Bansal. He's Director, India Foundation. Good evening and namaskar to both of you gentlemen. Ambassador Sajjanhar, let me start with you. It's interesting that the United States now threatens sanctions against India if we deal with Iran and we have business dealings with Iran. But can I understand from you if US can at all dictate terms to us in this matter?
Well, thank you very much, Shreya, for having me on your show. Yes, in 2018, when Mr. Trump was in the saddle, he had, there was a law that was put in, which was called CATSA, that is countering America's adversaries through Sanctions Act. That means those who did business trade with America's adversaries, like Iran, like Russian Federation, and one or two others, who were declared hostile and adversaries of America, if they did business with them, big business in defense, in energy, etc., then they would be liable to be put under sanction. That was the time when you might recall that in 2019, we stopped importing all oil from from Iran. We were at that time importing about, I think, more than 10-12% of our total requirements from Iran, more than about $12 billion, but we very gradually, we tapered it off, and then now there is no import of oil. But something similar was also posed against the import of S-400 ballistic missile defense system from Russia. And we did not pay any heed to that because we have been dependent upon Russian supplies for our defense requirements. And these defense requirements have been coming in, and there has been, while that sword of CATSA hangs over our heads, but no action has been taken. And I think our conversations had given us to understand that no action would be taken against India. Now, as far as you mentioned yourself, there was a waiver, there was a carve out in 2018 for Chabahar because at that time the Americans were still in Afghanistan. But as you know, 2 years ago, Americans have left Afghanistan on August the 15th, 2021. And so maybe now it is not of such great importance for them in terms of economic development, in terms of promoting connectivity to Afghanistan. But I think as far as Central Asia is concerned, it's very important. For India, it is very important. We have to exercise our strategic autonomy as far as our own preserving and promoting our own interests are concerned. And the final
Yes.
point I'd like to make here, Shreya, is I think in our track two, track one interactions with the Americans, we need to tell them that India's presence in Central Asia and in Afghanistan, because relations, whichever way they are going, but at least they are not as hostile as when the Taliban came in, that better India's relations with the Central Asia are in the interest of countries like the United States and the West, because otherwise, China is expanding its footprint there. And that is detrimental not only to India's interest,
Sure.
but also to the US interest. Shreya.
Yeah. Which was what my next question was, Captain Alok Bansal. You know, the fact that geopolitical situation has changed over the past few years. You have two wars going on as we speak. You've also got the Chinese threat that you have to deal with. In such a situation, how does India navigate its way through its relationship with the United States as well as sustaining its healthy relationship with Iran?
See, we need to be very clear. We have good relations with both the countries. United States continues to be one of our largest export destinations. Most of our exports go to United States, and it will be difficult for us to withstand US sanctions, especially for private companies. And we need to understand, though in 2018 there was an exemption for Chabahar, but still most of the shipping companies were unwilling to carry goods to Chabahar. We could not install cranes. There was delays because while Chabahar Port itself had been given an exemption, the other companies which had to deal and supply logistical issues became a nightmare because there were the threat of sanctions. Now, what has changed and why has US given this warning at this point of time? We need to understand. Firstly, unlike 2018, when Afghanistan was an important factor where US troops were there, NATO was present there, and I think it was in US interest to stabilize and develop Afghanistan. They have no such interest now in Afghanistan, considering the fact that you have a regime which is not recognized by any country in the world at this point of time. So Afghanistan is out. And the second issue which we need to understand is that probably, because please understand, US has not said that there'll be sanctions, but they have only given a threat of sanctions. And this also comes immediately after Pakistan signed a deal with Iran. And when they threatened Pakistan also that there'll be sanctions will be imposed.
But why do they even need to give that, Captain Bansal? They haven't imposed sanctions, but why do they even need to threaten India, one of their close allies, with sanctions?
No, they are not threatening, but I think this was probably to project to the world that they are even-handed in dealing with these countries. And I'm not trying to say that they will not do so. But in international relations, we need to understand that US has imposed sanctions on Iran. Although we also need to understand that President Biden, when he had come to power, one of his priorities was to reestablishing relations with Iran and reinstate, bringing back the Obama peace deal, which President Obama had signed with Iran. Unfortunately, he's not been done because the positions on both sides have got hardened, and now with the Hamas-Israel conflict and subsequent direct attacks on Iran and retaliation by Iran, things have really got aggravated. So that is as far as this is concerned. But we have a way of bypassing sanctions. We have continued to deal with the Russians, and we have actually been importing oil from Russia. We have done so. But at the same time, we also need to understand that our oil imports from Iran have come down to zero actually. So this is the impact of sanctions. Iran at one point of time was the second largest source of oil imports for us. Today it figures nowhere. So sanctions are an important factor, but Chabahar is extremely important for us because this is the only way for us to access the Eurasian heartland. Not only Afghanistan, where we don't really have too much of interest now, but Central Asian republics, Trans-Caucasus region, the Caucasus regions, the countries like Azerbaijan, Armenia, Georgia. If we have to access all these countries besides the Central Asian republics, Iran is the only country, and Chabahar is the closest port. The location of Chabahar being outside the
Sure.
Persian Gulf enables us to offload cargo faster and quicker. And it reduces costs considerably as compared to offloading cargo in Bandar Abbas, which
Okay.
is well inside Persian Gulf and very far off from Central Asian republics and Afghanistan. So the cost would also increase in case
Sure.
Chabahar port was not to develop fully. As of now, we have done some token shipments to Afghanistan in the past through Chabahar, but Chabahar has really not evolved
Okay.
as a credible gateway to Central Asia and Afghanistan, but because of various sanctions that were imposed on Iran.
Which
and
is
that
what the aim is. Which is what the aim is, to make it a gateway to Central Asia and Europe and a shorter trade route, of course. Ambassador Sajjanhar, but let me also understand from you, the big and the major concern amid all of this has been the Chinese threat, the Chinese tentacles that have been supposedly spreading in the region. How much of that would be impacted with this India-Iran relationship in the Chabahar port?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question, Shreya. Let's look at it first in terms of the relations between China and Iran as they have been evolving. Very recently they signed a $400 billion deal for the next 25 years, and also the the project, the major connectivity project called the Belt and Road Initiative that has been going through Central Asia and also through Iran. So as I mentioned earlier, China is expanding very significantly its footprint in Iran also. So if India, as both Captain Bansal and I have said, that since 2019, India has stopped importing oil from there, from Iran. And that used to be one of our major trade relations, business relations. But if we are to maintain a presence in Iran, then of course we need to go ahead as far as the Chabahar project is concerned. And I think this is also something that we need to project to the Americans, that if India doesn't go there, then the whole field is left open to China, and which is to the detriment not only of India, but of the United States and other Western countries. So India also has to be present there. Now, of course, there have been complications because even with the carve out, none of the companies, foreign companies and Indian companies have been willing to go in there. But I think of late, because we need both, it's not only a maintenance contract, it is also a development. We had spent $80 million when, you would recall, Prime Minister Modi had traveled to Iran after the JCPOA was signed, after the Iranian nuclear deal was signed, and we developed the Shahid Bahishti terminal in Chabahar. And we increased its capacity from 2.5 million tons to 8 million tons. So right now also we have committed that we are going to spend $120 million in expanding the capacity there, and also invest another $250 million. So I think when companies see this very long-term engagement and partnership of India with Iran, I think they will also feel encouraged, both Indian and foreign companies, to come there. And our access to Central Asia in that sense will be very significant, because without common borders, without contiguous borders, we are not really able to leverage our historical and civilizational links that we have with that region. And that region has been left completely open to China to go in, and whether it is in terms of minerals, whether it is in terms of oil. The only significant thing we are importing from there is uranium from Kazakhstan, which has world's second largest reserves and world's largest producer. But there are so many other items even in terms of trade. But, Chabahar has a significance, not only in terms of trade, but also a strategic and a geopolitical significance, which also we need to
Right.
make the Americans aware of it.
Okay.
Shreya.
Let me also quickly then ask you, Captain Bansal, just a very brief answer from you. The fact that, back in 2022, US had asked us to decrease our dependency on Russian energy. Now, of course, they've done a U-turn. You have Eric Garcetti, the US ambassador to India, saying, and let me quote him, saying that we wanted somebody to buy Russian oil at a price cap that was not a violation. Clearly, that change in stance that has happened, the US has been told by India clearly and firmly that, we have our own way of dealing with things and nobody can dominate us. Do you think that has been, working in favor of India in terms of the geopolitics that we are seeing? And also the fact that, what are the potential challenges now that you see that India could face in this kind of a scenario?
See, in bilateral relations, invariably you have to weigh costs. And I think in Russia's case, we felt that it was worth taking a chance because the benefits that we were getting as a huge importer of oil and with our close relationship with Russia was good. And I think eventually Americans also realized that it actually benefited because the petroleum products from Indian refineries were being exported to across the globe, including to the US. So eventually Russian oil, crude, which was being processed in Indian refineries, was going to the Western world. And I think they had no problems. And they realized, I think this is a system which works well. It keeps the oil prices low and other issues. Now, in the case of Iran, unfortunately, despite our having been involved with Chabahar for some time, it has really not emerged as a credible port of entry for Central Asia and Afghanistan. But we would eventually like to do so. As I said, economically, it's a very important port. We would connect it to North-South corridor eventually and take it to the Eurasian heartland. And as you know, geopolitically, Mackinder said centuries ago that whoever controls the Eurasian heartland would control the world. So Eurasian heartland is the pivot point, is actually a very, very important arena as far as geopolitics is concerned. So I think government of India as of now would be in wait and watch system because it's only a warning. And as you know, in 2018, Chabahar was given explicitly an exception. So maybe we may be in a position to negotiate subsequently with the Americans and get an exemption for Chabahar. Maybe at this point of time, when they probably didn't want to be seen as partisans, since they have given a stricter warning to Pakistan, which is actually a far bigger project because they are going to import gas and oil from Iran through pipelines, and which would be a major violation of the sanctions which US has imposed because they don't want their hydrocarbons.
Okay, so we'll have to see how this really pans out between India and the United States. We'll have to leave it there. Captain Alok Bansal and Ambassador Ashok Sajjanhar, thank you very much to both of you gentlemen for joining us on Nation Tonight and sharing your perspective on this extremely important, strategically important Chabahar port for India. Thank you very much.